How could a few old flings destroy my whole family? I thought what I did before marriage was my business alone. But then my husband laid out printed messages in front of my parents, and suddenly, I was the one on trial, while he stood there calm, legal papers in his hand. My name is Isolde Marin. I am 32 years old, and I have always believed that I deserve more than what I get. Daniel is 35, steady and calm, the kind of man who thinks rules are everything. We have 2 children, Ella, who is 7, and Noah, who is 4, both too young to understand why the air in the house has turned sharp and cold. I kept telling myself that my past was mine alone. The times with Liam, the messages, the fun before I settled down, none of it mattered after the wedding. I said it so many times I almost believed it. When Daniel started looking at me differently, when his silence stretched longer each night, I told myself he was insecure, paranoid, even weak. I laughed about it to my mother, who said men always try to control women when they feel threatened. My father shook his head and told me to stop humiliating my husband, but I brushed him off. I told my sister Marla that Daniel was too serious, that he could not handle my honesty, and she warned me quietly that I was playing with fire. Still, I did not stop. I thought I was untouchable, that if I controlled the story, I controlled the truth. But Daniel was patient in a way I did not understand. While I was joking and bragging, he was already preparing. I only realized too late that his silence was not surrender. It was strategy. It began at home, small and quiet, the kind of moment most people would forget. Daniel had asked about some old messages he noticed when my phone lit up on the counter, and I laughed it off, saying he was worrying about things that did not matter anymore. I told him anything that happened before marriage was not his concern, that past mistakes stayed in the past, and he should stop digging. He looked at me with that still face of his, the one that showed nothing, and I took his silence as proof I had won. Later that week, we went out to dinner with friends, and the subject of past relationships came up around the table. Everyone shared funny stories, and I leaned back with a smile, saying my husband could not get over the fact that I used to have fun before I married him. I added that he acted as if old flings still counted, when everyone knew they did not. The table laughed, and I felt the rush of being the clever one. Daniel sat there with his glass in hand, quiet, and the silence only encouraged me to say more. I told our friends that he could not handle the idea that someone else had wanted me once, as if I was supposed to erase my life before him. They laughed again, some patting him on the back, like he was a sulking child. I thought I was showing strength, but what I was really doing was stripping him of dignity in front of people who would not forget. When we got home, he went straight to the bedroom and said he was tired. I thought it was sulking, the way a man pouts when his pride is hurt. I told myself he would get over it, that he always did. What I did not notice then was the way he had started paying attention differently. He was not asking questions anymore. He was watching, he was listening. His phone was in his hand more often, not because he was distracted, but because he was recording what I was letting slip. The children noticed the change before I did. Ella asked me why Daddy did not smile anymore. I told her he was busy at work, too tired to play. Noah clung to me more, quiet and restless, sensing what I kept trying to deny. I spun the story to my mother, saying Daniel was too serious and needed to lighten up. She agreed quickly, as she always did, saying men like to exaggerate problems to keep their wives guilty. My father, however, shook his head at me. He said Daniel had every right to feel uneasy and warned me that I was humiliating him more than I realized. I rolled my eyes, telling him he was old-fashioned. My sister Marla stayed quiet most of the time, but once when we were alone, she told me she thought I was being reckless. She said Daniel was a good man and that I was not being fair. I snapped back that she did not understand, that she was too boring to know what it felt like to be admired. She did not argue, but the disappointment in her face stayed with me long after she left. One evening, I passed by the living room and saw Daniel holding my phone. He was not scrolling quickly like a jealous man. He was calm, patient, capturing something with his own device. When he noticed me watching, he set the phone back down and said he was just checking the time. I pretended to believe him because admitting the truth meant I was already caught. I told myself he had nothing, that he was only bluffing, but a cold knot grew in my chest that I could not shake. The laughter at the dinner, the smugness I felt when my friend sided with me, the little thrill from Liam's name lighting up my phone, all of it seemed so harmless in the moment. But Daniel's silence was no longer weakness. It was the sound of someone building a case, brick by brick, while I handed him the pieces. I thought I was untouchable. I was wrong. The messages with Liam were my secret fuel, the spark I carried in my pocket during long days at work. He was an old co-worker, someone I had fooled around with before I married Daniel, and I told myself that history made it harmless. When his name appeared on my screen with a memory or a compliment, I felt alive again. I told myself I was only talking, nothing more, and that Daniel was ridiculous for thinking words on a phone meant anything. I leaned into that logic so hard that I almost convinced myself. At the office, while answering calls or filing paperwork, I would sneak glances at my phone and smile. Daniel noticed. He asked why I seemed distracted. I told him he was imagining things. He asked why I kept turning my phone face down. I laughed and said he was paranoid. I painted myself as the reasonable one, telling anyone who listened that my husband had become controlling. When my mother visited, I told her Daniel was jealous of ghosts. She agreed with me, saying men often invent stories to trap women into obedience. My father overheard and told me flatly that I was playing a dangerous game. I waved him off, reminding him that what I did before marriage was none of Daniel's business. Marla came by one evening and said she thought Daniel looked worn down, like a man waiting for something to break. I told her she was overreacting, that she always took his side. She did not argue further, but her silence was heavier than words. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior shifted in ways I did not understand at first. He did not argue anymore. He did not ask for explanations. He watched. He listened. At dinners, he would sit quietly, cutting food for Noah, asking Ella about school, and never once mentioning Liam. I thought his silence was proof I had won. I bragged to my friends that I could say whatever I wanted, and Daniel would just sit there, powerless. They laughed and told me I had him wrapped around my finger. I let their laughter feed me, blind to the truth, but I saw small cracks in my comfort. One night, I left my phone on the counter while I put Noah to bed. When I came back, it was back in the exact same spot, but the screen had been cleared. My stomach twisted, but I told myself I was imagining things. Another evening, I woke in the middle of the night and found Daniel at the dining table with paper spread in front of him. He closed the folder when he noticed me. I asked what he was doing, and he said it was work. His voice was calm, his hand steady. I wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes made me uneasy. Still, I did not stop. I leaned harder into Liam's messages, answering with little details about my day, letting him remind me of who I used to be. I even told my friends that Daniel could never make me feel as exciting as my old flings had. They laughed, and I felt bold again. I thought the silence at home was weakness, when, in truth, it was strategy. Daniel was not sulking, he was preparing. The final sign came at a family dinner. We were all gathered around the table when my mother mentioned how lively I seemed lately. I smirked and said Daniel hated it, that he wanted me to erase everything before marriage. My father looked at me sharply and told me enough was enough. Daniel did not defend himself. He simply excused himself from the table and left early, leaving me to explain his absence. I told everyone he was being dramatic. My mother nodded. My father stayed silent. Marla avoided my eyes. And in that silence, I felt something shift. Daniel was no longer the husband I mocked for being weak. He was the man quietly collecting every piece of proof I was handing him, and I was too stubborn to stop. The night at the restaurant should have been just another gathering with friends, but it turned into something larger than I expected. We were seated at a long table, laughter filling the air, people drinking and sharing stories. I liked those moments because I could shine, showing everyone that I was witty and fun. When someone asked about relationships, I leaned back and said my husband still obsessed over mistakes I made before we were even married. I told the group that men could be so fragile, always clinging to the past, as if a few flings mattered once vows were spoken. The table roared with laughter, and I felt powerful. I smirked as I pointed out that Daniel worried too much, that he was too serious, that he could not handle the fact I had been wanted by others. The laughter grew louder, and people nudged him, waiting for him to fight back. He did not. He stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on his plate, his hand steady around his glass. For me, his silence was an opportunity. I pressed harder, adding little lines about how wives could still have admirers, how it did not mean anything, and how only insecure men failed to understand that. My friends laughed, some clapping their hands, while Daniel sat as if he were not even there. I told myself he was sulking, that he did not dare speak because he knew I would twist his words. I thought I had cornered him. What I did not see was how everyone else at the table looked at him, not me. They saw a man humiliated, not a woman clever enough to win an argument. When the check came, Daniel placed his card down without a word. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and left before anyone else moved. The room fell silent for a moment before people tried to return to their conversations, but the air was thick. I laughed it off, telling them he always needed to cool down after a joke, that he would be fine. A few forced smiles appeared, but I noticed some of the women looking at me with pity instead of amusement. When I got home later, Daniel was already there. He had put the children to bed and sat alone in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. He did not look up when I entered. I tried to start a conversation, but he only said he was tired and went to bed. His calmness made my skin crawl. I told myself he was being childish, but inside, I felt something new. Fear. Over the next days, the shift deepened. At breakfast, he spoke only to Ella and Noah. At dinner, he asked Ella about school projects and helped Noah with his food, never once looking at me. Ella asked why Daddy never smiled anymore. I told her he was just busy. She did not believe me. Noah clung to my arm, as if he sensed the distance growing in the house. Friends began to whisper too. Cassidy, who had laughed the loudest at the restaurant, later asked me quietly if I was worried Daniel might leave. I scoffed and said he would never dare, that he needed me too much. But even as I said it, I felt the words ring hollow. At the next family dinner, the divide was clear. My mother repeated that I was young, that Daniel was too rigid, that I deserved more freedom. My father cut her off and said bluntly that I was humiliating him. The room went still. Marla kept her eyes down, pushing food on her plate. I laughed loudly, forcing the noise to cover the tension, but Daniel said nothing. He finished his meal, thanked my parents, and left early again. That night, I found him at his desk, slipping papers into a folder. He closed it as soon as I entered. He said it was work. His voice was steady, his face unreadable. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew those papers had nothing to do with his job. Daniel was not sulking. He was planning. The house became colder with each passing week. Not because of the weather, but because of the silence Daniel wrapped around me. He spoke only when necessary, and even then, his words were aimed at the children. At breakfast, he asked Ella if she was ready for her spelling test. At dinner, he told Noah to eat his vegetables. To me, he said nothing. I tried to draw him into arguments, hoping to spark some reaction, but he refused every time. I accused him of ignoring me, of being childish, of making the children uncomfortable. He only nodded and went back to his papers. I thought silence was weakness, but now it felt like being shut out of my own home. Ella noticed first. She asked why Daddy never laughed anymore. I told her he was tired from work, painting him as the one who was broken. Noah asked if Daddy was angry. I told him no, insisting everything was fine, even as my own voice trembled. My mother came over one afternoon, and I told her Daniel was overreacting, that he had made up this story about me being unfaithful when all I had done was joke. She told me he was insecure and needed to be reminded who was in charge. My father overheard and shook his head, saying I was blind to the damage I was causing. I snapped at him, telling him he was taking Daniel's side. Marla called me late one night, her voice quiet, asking if it was true that I was still in touch with Liam. I laughed and said it was harmless, that what happened before marriage did not count. She did not laugh. She told me Daniel looked like a man breaking apart and that I was being cruel. I hung up before she could say more, convincing myself she was exaggerating. But the unease lingered. Daniel's mother, Judith, came to visit next. She looked around the house, saw the tension, and told me directly that I had humiliated her son for too long. She said he was stronger than I thought, and that I should be careful. I rolled my eyes, saying she never liked me anyway. She left without another word, but her look told me she already knew what was coming. One Friday, Daniel left early in the morning, saying only that he had errands. He did not return until late Sunday evening. I told myself he was staying with a friend, maybe his parents. When he came back, he greeted the children warmly, tucked them into bed, and then sat at the dining table with a folder. I asked where he had been. He said only that he had been busy. His voice was calm, his movements precise. He placed papers into the folder, clipped them neatly, and set them aside. The way he handled them made my stomach knot. At the next family dinner, I tried to control the story. I told everyone Daniel had become obsessed with the past, that he was trying to punish me for things that happened years ago. My mother nodded quickly, but my father cut me off. He said loudly that betrayal is betrayal, no matter when it happened. The room froze. Marla put her fork down and quietly excused herself. Daniel stayed silent, finishing his meal. Before leaving, he placed the same folder on the table beside him and rested his hand on it. He did not open it. He did not speak. He only looked at me once, long enough for me to feel exposed, and then carried it out when he left. I laughed nervously, saying he was being dramatic again, but no one laughed with me. Even my mother stayed quiet this time. That was when I finally understood. Daniel was not waiting for me to confess. He was preparing to show the truth himself. The confrontation came not with shouting, but with the sound of paper sliding across wood. One evening, Daniel returned from work, set his briefcase down, and placed an envelope on the kitchen table. He told me everything I needed to know without saying a word. My name was at the top of the documents, legal language filling every line. It was a separation notice, along with custody motions and financial protections. I stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. My first instinct was anger. I told myself he was abandoning his family, that he was trying to paint me as unfit when all I had done was speak the truth about my past. But the papers were clear. He had gathered proof, consulted a lawyer, and prepared his case. I tried to confront him, demanding to know how he could do this to me. He said calmly that everything was explained in the documents. His voice was steady, not raised, not emotional, just final. I accused him of betraying our children by tearing apart the home. He replied that he was protecting them. His composure unnerved me more than any argument ever had. I ran to my parents' house, waving the papers and insisting Daniel was trying to destroy me. My mother gasped and said he was being cruel, that men always use the law to control women. She told me not to panic, that he would calm down. But my father read the documents quietly and then looked at me with disappointment. He said Daniel was right to defend himself, that I had mocked and humiliated him for too long. His words burned, but I ignored them, clinging to my mother's comfort instead. When my sister Marla came over, I tried to make her see it my way. I told her Daniel was inventing stories, twisting harmless messages into betrayal. She asked softly if the texts with Liam were real. I admitted they were, but said they meant nothing. She shook her head and said nothing more, but her silence told me she no longer believed me. The worst moment came when Daniel sat at the dining table and placed a neat stack of printed messages in front of me. They were my conversations with Liam, every word preserved, every line showing I had kept contact long after the wedding. He did not accuse me. He did not argue. He simply left them there and walked away. I sat frozen, staring at my own words, unable to twist them into jokes anymore. Judith, his mother, called me not long after. She told me directly that I had underestimated her son, that he was not weak, and that I would soon see just how strong he could be. I snapped back that she had hated me from the start, but the truth was her warning shook me. Daniel was no longer the man I mocked for being silent. He was the man who had built a case so carefully that I could not escape it. The children began to notice the changes too. Ella asked if we were moving. Noah clung to Daniel during bedtime, sensing that something was shifting. I told them nothing was wrong, but even they seemed to know better. When Daniel finally told me there would be a formal meeting, with my parents present, I felt my stomach drop. He said the evidence would be shared openly, that it was time everyone saw the truth. His calmness was unbearable, like a man who had already won. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing I had mistaken his silence for surrender. In reality, it was preparation. And soon, my parents would see every piece of proof he had collected. The day of the meeting arrived, and I felt like I was walking into a trial where I was the only one on the stand. It was held at my parents' house, a place I usually considered safe, but this time, the walls felt closer, the air heavier. Daniel arrived with a folder under his arm and his lawyer beside him. My parents sat together on the couch, my mother clutching a tissue, my father stiff and silent. Marla sat near the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I wanted to believe this was just a performance, that Daniel was trying to scare me into backing down. But the moment he placed that folder on the coffee table, I knew it was more than that. The mediator, a calm woman I had never met before, began reading through the documents, custody arrangements, financial protections, property divisions, all laid out in black and white. Daniel had planned for everything. The children would stay primarily with him during the week, with me having weekends and certain holidays. He had proof of his stable income, his ability to provide consistent care, and his strong family support system. My lawyer tried to argue that the children needed their mother more, but then Daniel slid the printed texts across the table. My own words with Liam were there in front of everyone. Messages filled with nostalgia, flattery, and admissions that I still thought about him even after the wedding. I wanted to explain, to say they were harmless, but the evidence did not leave space for my excuses. My father read silently, his face turning hard. He asked me if the messages were real. I admitted they were, but said they meant nothing. He shook his head, saying betrayal was betrayal, no matter the timing. My mother tried to defend me, saying everyone has a past. But even she faltered when she saw the dates on the messages, proof that the contact went well beyond what I had called harmless history. Marla did not say a word. She only looked at me with disappointment, and I could not bear to meet her eyes. The mediator announced the financial rulings next. Daniel had secured our accounts in ways I had not noticed, transferring and protecting assets so that I could not touch them. His records were perfect, every expense traced, every detail documented. My lawyer tried to challenge some of it, but Daniel's precision left no opening. What I once mocked as dull discipline had become the weapon that dismantled me. I tried one last time to twist the story. I said Daniel was cold, that his silence had driven me into distraction, that I had needed attention because he gave me none. But no one responded. Not my father, not Marla, not even my mother this time. The mediator reminded us that the decision was not about my feelings, but about what was best for the children. When it was over, the mediator declared the agreement final. Daniel stood, shook hands with his lawyer, and gathered his folder. He did not look at me, he did not speak to me. He only nodded politely to my parents before walking out the door. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, steady and sure. I sat frozen on the couch, my own parents looking at me as if I were a stranger. The man I had mocked for being too quiet had walked out stronger than I ever imagined, leaving me with nothing but my own words printed on paper. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.